Hey guys, welcome back to Fix It Friday. So this week we're going to be working on the Sega Nomad. This is a portable version of the Sega Genesis, and this was released only in the United States and in Japan in the late 90s. And it's a pretty cool concept to be able to play Sega Genesis games on the go. However, that being said, a lot of these things, if you find them out there, they're pretty hard to find in decent shape. This one in particular has a totally washed out, ruined screen, so you can barely even see what's going on. And nowadays, we don't have to settle for that. There's a whole bunch of mods that you can do to improve the video and also the audio experience on the Sega Nomad. So today what we're going to do is take this thing apart, and we're going to go through a couple of different mods to restore functionality for Sega Master System, for Sega CD games, and also upgrade the screen so it looks better than it ever did before. All right, let's get to it. First, I'd like to thank PCBWay.com for supporting this week's episode. Now, I use PCBWay on a regular basis because I'm always in need of new PCBs for my projects, and I can count on them to deliver them quickly. And now, PCBWay is celebrating the holidays by offering several promotions. There are discounts of up to 50% off that are now available for PCB prototype, PCB assembly, and Flex PCB orders. So, if you're creating and developing new electronics projects, PCBWay has got you covered. Thanks again for your support, and now let's get back to this week's project. Okay, so before I start doing any mods, I just wanted to show you what this screen looks like before I, take anything apart or remove it. And I've got the game Lightning Force here, also known as Thunder Force 4. And I mean, as you can see, I'm trying my best here, but you can barely see it on the camera. The screen must have gotten some kind of exposure to sunlight, and so it's really burned out and washed out, especially in the center right here. So it's pretty much unusable. But of course, if I use the external multi-out, which is located right here, and plug it into a television, everything looks perfectly fine. So I know that the console is not broken or anything like that. Everything's great. It's just that the screen is totally washed out and ruined. So let's go ahead and take this thing apart and start adding in some of the new functionality that we're going to do to it. Okay, so taking apart the Sega Nomad is actually pretty easy. There's a security bit screw which you can remove right over here, and then there's 4 Phillips on the back. And once those are out, it breaks apart into 2 portions. So you've got like the main Sega Genesis PCB over here, and then this is the sub PCB, which does like the audio and video, and probably some other functions too, but definitely audio and video is handled primarily here. So from here, everything is pretty cut and dry. To disconnect this, you just have to push this little latch downward like so, and then the flex cable comes out. And then there's 3 screws that you need to remove. There's one here, there's one right over here, and then a third one here. And then once you disconnect the speaker and this little start button PCB, you can take this board out. Now on this board, it's not too different. There's just a whole bunch of Phillips screws. You just have to keep track of where they are. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start with this PCB first and just remove all that stuff. We'll be back in a second. Okay, so we've got the Sega Nomad motherboard out, and the next thing we're gonna do is add Sega Master System functionality back into it. So this mod is actually pretty easy in principle. The only challenge is just the soldering itself. So what we gotta do is this main ASIC chip here needs a wire soldered to it. So very specifically, we're gonna be soldering it to pin 45. So finding pin 45 is not that hard. You can see all these dots here. They're for every 5th pin. So 5, 10, 15, 20, on and on. And this one right here is pin 45. So we're gonna take a small piece of Kynar wire, which is what you see right here. It's 30 gauge. I'm gonna solder it to that. And then we're gonna flip it over, and we need to solder to this point right here. This is cartridge slot B30 right here. So once you make that connection, Sega Master System games will work either with an adapter if you're using real cartridges, or with a flash cart if you're using the Mega EverDrive Pro. All right, so let me go ahead and solder this into position, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so you can see now that this wire here is connected to the cartridge slot and all the way to the ASIC. So that's all set. And the next thing we're gonna do is start working on adding Sega CD audio back to the Sega Nomad. So the first step is actually pretty easy. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take two wires and we're gonna solder them to these 2 points right here. This is B1 and B3 on the cartridge slot. So B1 is left channel audio and B3 is right channel audio. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and just do that real quick. Okay, so the back half of the Sega Nomad has been reassembled, and then you can see I have the 2 wires coming out from here for left and right channel CD audio. So we'll be connecting these up a little bit later. But now what we're gonna do is turn our attention to this horrible, sad screen. So to disconnect it, all you've got to do is just remove 4 screws on the corners here. And then there's also this little connector here that's used for power. So you just got to pull that out. And at this point, we're at the point of no return here. So what we're going to do is just start by removing this little tape here. And now we're going to go ahead with a craft knife and just carefully cut the LCD out. So this is the point of no return, as it were. Okay, that's it. All right, so the first thing that we're going to be doing is installing this little daughter board right here. I picked this up off of eBay from a seller named Retromancer, and basically what it does is it takes the RGB signal coming out of the Nomad and it shapes it properly so that when it goes to the SCART connector, you get proper levels of RGB. Without this, the colors are all going to be like washed out effectively. So the little board kind of sits right over here. It's pretty small and out of the way. And we're not going to use all of it. There's a couple of pads on here that we really don't need at all. But what we're going to do is we're going to start by getting RGB from the board. And the best place to do that is right over here. This is the Sony CXA RGB encoder, and every Sega Genesis has some version of this chip. So RGB is located right here on these 3 pins. So it's red, green, and blue. So I'm going to tack in some wires onto this chip here and put them over here to the inputs. Okay, so our RGB inputs have been installed, and I also forgot to install a ground wire. So what I'm doing for ground is just tapping from the negative side of this 10 microfarad capacitor, because this is tied to ground. So now we've got our ground in. There's also a pad for 5 volts and for C-Sync, but we actually don't really need these. This is something that it's totally not necessary, and we can tap it on the other side of the board. So I'm just going to omit those connections. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take RGB out from here and connect that up to our LCDDRV board, which I'll show you in a moment. So we'll make those connections there. And then when we flip over the board, we also need to get C-Sync, and we're going to get that from TP 248 right over here. So that's a very close connection to where the screen is going to be. And then right over here, we can tap into 5 volts. So we can get 5 volts from test pad 209, and then we can also get ground over here from 210. So I personally prefer to get my 5 volts and ground from there, just because everything's on this side. So now, let's go ahead and take a look at the LCDDRV board. So it's really nice that these are back in stock, because during the pandemic, these basically became impossible to get. And so now it's not that hard to get them. You can get them from AliExpress for about $75, and they work very nicely on the Turbo Express and also on the Nomad. So what I have here is a 3D printed bracket, and so here's our screen right here. It has a protective film on for now. And then the 3D printed design has these little retaining flaps, I guess, and I attach them so that the larger piece is on the bottom of the LCD-DRV, the thinner piece is here on the top. So the way that this works is that you place it like so that the top of the screen is on this side. And when you flip it over, you can slide these little retaining clips into position like this, and that keeps everything in place. And then what I'll usually do is just take like a little dab of hot glue or something, just like here and here in the 4 corners, just to keep these clips from moving anymore. And that pretty securely locks everything into place. All right, so then what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be connecting RGB and C-Sync from all of those positions on the board, and then we're going to get 5 volts and ground from our test points on the front. And right now I'm going to deliberately use long wires, and the reason why is because there are a few controls here on the side. There's saturation, contrast, and brightness. So I'm going to manually adjust those once the screen is tested and working, just to make sure that all the levels look good. And then once I'm happy with that, then I'm going to use shorter wires and kind of complete the setup. All right, so let's go ahead and make those connections. Okay, so I have everything reconnected, and I've got the Mega SD plugged in for my testing purposes. And then just flipping it over really quick, I can show you the connections. So RGB are coming from the underside from that little daughter board and going right over here into the RGB pads. C-Sync is connected to test pad 48, which you can see right over here. And then the screen is going to get 5 volts and ground from those 2 test pads. The upper one here is 5 volts. The lower one over here is ground. So now let's go ahead and just give this thing a test and see how this image looks. All right. Yeah, so it looks awesome. I mean, it's a colossally huge difference compared to that horrible washed out, ruined screen that we were working with beforehand. So yeah, now what I'm going to do off camera is I'm going to use the Mega SD and load up the 240p test suite. And then I'm going to use these controls here on the back for for brightness, contrast, and saturation, and then just adjust the color levels so that everything looks really good. Once that's done, then I'm going to go ahead and just shorten all of these connections, and then we'll be back to work on the final step, which is to complete the CD audio. All right, so I have reassembled this thing for the most part, and you can see here's what the new screen looks like with all of the colors and contrast and everything dialed in, and personally I think it looks just gorgeous. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge improvement over what we were dealing with when we started. So we're almost done here. The last thing we've got to do is deal with this set of wires here. This is for the CD audio. So thankfully, I don't have to fully take this thing apart. I just have to open up the back half again. And with a few simple modifications, we're going to have this thing finished. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to be doing is finishing up this CD audio mod right here. And so you can see that I've got my blue wire here. This is my left channel audio, and purple, this is my right channel audio. And they're both connected up the exact same way. So in both cases, I have a 10 microfarad 16 volt capacitor plugged in, and it's connected to the negative side of the capacitor on both sides. And then the positive end is connected up to a 10 kilo ohm resistor. So both of them are wired up exactly the same way. So the last thing that we need to do now is connect these two wires to this chip right here, which handles audio. So left channel is going to go to pin 14, which is all the way right over here. And just like before, we can use these dots to tell us where we are. So this is 5, 10, 15. So 1 over from this dot is pin 14. Now, right channel audio is going to go to pin 20. And pin 20 actually connects up to this little capacitor right here, C15, 215. So I'm actually going to connect to there because it's a lot easier than connecting to the chip. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and take care of these two connections. And once that's done, we are ready to go. Okay, so I've gone ahead and reassembled the Sega Nomad, and right now we are using the Mega SD just to test out the Sega CD sound. And so yeah, you can hear that the sounds being produced by the Genesis are there, and all of the CD sounds are also present. So it looks like the audio mod worked, and the screen mod worked, and pretty much everything is looking better than it ever has before. So yeah, if you happen to own a Sega Nomad, especially if you have a destroyed screen like the one that we had here, I highly recommend this collection of mods because it really does a lot to make the system pretty enjoyable and pretty amazing. It's also worth noting that when you do these audio mods, all of the functionality is still present. So the multi-out has sound, and so does the headphone jack. This is a new update to the mod that was recently published by Leon Kirilluk on Twitter. So yeah, definitely check out his stuff as well. All right, guys, so that's it for this week's video. If you like this kind of content, then consider subscribing to the channel. I have videos out every Friday, and then, of course, if you need a console repaired or modified, you can always reach me directly at oneuprestorations.com. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.